So this first part of the course is looking at the approaches in psychology, and before we do that we need to make sure we understand what an approach actually is. So put very simply, an approach is a way of explaining behaviour. If you were to imagine that those three people in the image were all psychologists, you could think that each of them have a different way, a different explanation to say how it is that people behave. And they would each have a key idea or a key concept that they would use to explain that. So each of the approaches we're going to look at has a key concept and uses that concept to explain behaviour. In this course, you need to know about the behaviorist approach, the biological approach, cognitive approach, the psychodynamic approach, and the humanist approach. So the key concept behind the behaviorist approach is the idea that our behaviour comes from the environment. So we learn how to behave from our experiences and the things that happen to us and the things that happen around us. The biological approach, as its name suggests, focuses on human physiology. So it's our internal environment, our organs, biochemistry, the brain structure, all of those things that influence how we actually behave. The cognitive approach is focused on cognitions, also known as thought processes. So the cognitive approach, the key concept there is that it's these thought processes that actually determine how we behave. The and the humanist approach you don't need to know until A-level, so we will come back and look at those in later screencasts as we go into year 13. So the behaviourist approach then is broadly split into three different areas. We've got classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning theory, and we're going to have three different lessons on those three different components. And for this first, we're going to be focusing on classical conditioning. So at its very simplest, classical conditioning is learning through association. So something happens, a stimulus, and that stimulus causes us to respond in a particular way. So it's thinking about involuntary behaviours rather than voluntary behaviours. So that's things which we have no control over, we would do just automatically. So we're going to apply the process of classical conditioning to an example. There are lots and lots of key terms that you need to know in classical conditioning, but they do all make sense. So if you think about the way the terminology is constructed, they're actually very logical in the way that these terms are used. So we're going to use an example which is quite famous within psychology. It's a study which we will come back and look at in more detail when we look at phobias. And it involves an infant. So the three stages of classical conditioning then, before, during and after conditioning. So conditioning is, in this sense, just another word for the term learning. So before conditioning is before learning has occurred. So we're thinking about what happens naturally before any learning has taken place. And in this case, we have what we call an unconditioned stimulus. Now, an unconditioned stimulus can be anything which causes a response which hasn't been learned. So in this case, we're going to think about a loud noise. If you bang a loud noise next to a baby, they will have a response, probably a fear response, maybe upset, but there will be a natural response in some way, and that response hasn't been learned. So we call that an unconditioned response. And in this case, it's quite possibly going to be fear. Now we also have what we term a neutral stimulus, and a neutral stimulus, as the word neutral would suggest, is something which doesn't cause any response at all, and in this case we're going to use a rat. So you present the rat to the infant and there's no response there. Now during conditioning, the key idea of classical conditioning is that these two things are paired. So the unconditioned stimulus, which gives a fear response, is paired with the neutral stimulus, which is the rat. And because that unconditioned stimulus is there, the response you get is still fear. So you still get the unconditioned response. And this is done multiple times. So if the association is very, very strong, maybe you would only need one pairing. But more often than not, you need multiple pairings for an association to occur. So once this has happened several times, after conditioning, the rat, which used to be the neutral stimulus, then becomes the conditioned stimulus or the learned stimulus. A conditioned stimulus is something that we've learned to respond to. And now if you present the rat to the infant, you get the conditioned response, which is fear. So this isn't an automatic response. The conditioned response is the same actual response as the unconditioned response, but it's learned. So instead of happening naturally, it's something that the infant has learned to do. Now, the key study that you need to know around classical conditioning is incredibly famous. It's quite possibly one you've already heard of, and was carried out by a man called Pavlov. He was actually he was carrying out different research into the digestive systems of dogs. And he noticed, while he was carrying out this research, that when the technicians who would wear white lab coats came into the room, the dogs would start to salivate even though there was no food present. And he thought that maybe that was because the dogs had started to associate the technicians who fed them with the food that was being given to them. So he constructed an experiment in which the setup was what you can see here in the diagram. So the dogs were in harnesses, and they were presented with food at various times, and the level of saliva that was produced was recorded. So remember, the salivation, the response to food, is an involuntary response, because with classical conditioning we are looking at involuntary behaviours rather than voluntary behaviours. So each time Pavlov produced the food to the dog, he would ring a bell at the same time. So the bell would be the neutral stimulus, and then he measured that salivary response, particularly after this association had occurred, whether that salivary response was seen even when the food wasn't presented. And he did find out that that association could happen. So classical conditioning could work, and the dogs would salivate to the sound of the bell rather than to the presentation of the food. So if we just look at this again, looking at the before conditioning, during conditioning and after conditioning stages, and apply it to Pavlov, the unconditioned stimulus, the thing that the dog would respond to anyway, was the food, and the unconditioned response was the salivation. The neutral stimulus was the bell, and initially, before conditioning occurred, there was no response there. When the food was paired with the bell, it gave the unconditioned response, which was salivation again. That happened multiple times, and eventually the bell itself would be enough to provoke the conditioned response, which was salivation. So other key terms then that you need to know about classical conditioning. Generalization, which is when a conditioned response is the same response is seen when other stimuli are presented which are similar. So for example, other bells which sound similar to the original bell, the dog would also start to salivate at that. That would be an example of generalization. Discrimination is the opposite. So if a dog will only salivate to a particular type of bell and not other bells, that is what discrimination is. And finally, time contiguity. So the association will only occur if the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are presented at the same time. So it's no point in presenting the food and then 5 minutes later ringing the bell. They've got to be very, very closely presented together. Okay, things you need to do then to check that you understand this before you come into the lesson. First of all, can you write an explanation of classical conditioning in your own words using the key terms, but not using an example? This is something that you sometimes have to do in an exam. Secondly, can you write an outline of Pavlov Study? So that's the aim, the method, the results and the conclusion, without looking at this PowerPoint or the pre-reading. Thirdly, are you confident what we mean by generalization, discrimination and time contiguity? If you need some extra help, you can look back over this video, or you can go and have a look at the pre-reading, which will take things into a little bit more depth.